I say concentration both on the upside and the downside. 5 or 6 years ago, the federal government came out with a report where they looked at neighborhoods along something like 20-some or 12 indicators of well-being or distress, and they found 791 neighborhoods in Canada. They had upped it from, that was like almost double from the last time I looked, were experiencing what they would call distress. It understood by pretty poor outcomes on health, income, employment, community safety, education, etc. So kind of a clustering of issues. And they found them concentrated in neighborhoods in the same way that you would find concentrations of pretty good well-being indicators in a lot of other neighborhoods. But what was worrying was that they were being concentrated. And not only were they being concentrated, but the evidence suggests, and people still debate this a little bit, but I think it's hard to ignore the evidence on this, that well-being is amplified in a neighborhood. Place matters. So, as a rough kind of blunt way of describing this, if you are experiencing poor educational outcomes in a lower income neighborhood or a distressed neighborhood versus one that's generally well-being, the likelihood that you're going to experience poor outcomes on education in the future are amplified, right? It's kind of a feedback thing. It improves the probability that things will get better or worse in that neighborhood. On average, there's lots of exceptions. So, if in the big search that we all have about to answer the question, what's the highest and best use of our time? If we're concerned about social and economic well-being, it's important to at least be clearly present at the neighborhood level. Issue number 2. Neighborhood level stuff is more manageable than citywide stuff. So if you're a citywide manager dealing with police or housing or any kind of services, when you look at the numbers and the complexities and the whole span of things that need to happen to deal with your specific issue, the numbers look pretty bloody daunting, right? In Edmonton, there's 75,000 people living under the low-income cutoff rate and thousands on a waiting list for housing because of the boom. I can only imagine what it's like to work in police services, looking at all those big aggregate numbers and saying, how do we move the needle on all of these things on a citywide agenda? When you go to the neighborhood level, particularly a smaller level, these things become more manageable, and that's important because complex, our well-being is not a bunch of individual lists of things, they are all connected. I'm going to read you a quote here from a book called Working Poor by David Shipler. And he's talking about the complexities underlying the reality of a working poor mother in, I think it's Chicago. A rundown apartment can exacerbate a child's asthma, which leads to a call for an ambulance, which generates a medical bill that cannot be paid, which ruins a credit record, which then hikes the interest rate on an auto loan, which forces the purchase of an unreliable used car, which then jeopardizes the mother's punctuality at work and limits her promotions and earning capacity, which again confines you to poor housing, and the cycle is reinforced. If problems are interlocking, then so must solutions be. A job alone is not enough. Medical insurance alone is not enough. Good housing alone is not enough. Reliable transportation, careful family budgeting, effective parenting, effective schooling alone are not enough when each is achieved in isolation from the rest. We have problem-solving machines that are highly specialized, and you've talked the language of silos, and when you are highly specialized, those things are helpful, but it's not helpful in a real given complex for this mother we just talked about. Orchestration is the key. It is the links between these things that matter. And that linking and those connecting can happen really quite more powerfully at a manageable scale at the neighborhood level. At least the possibilities and the probabilities are that much greater. Number 3, there's lots of underutilized assets in neighborhoods, right? There's skills, knowledge, access to resources, and there's lots of studies when you do cost-benefit analyses, really broad ones. When a big institution goes in and does something, if you spread the web and look at how much the contributions in time are in terms of volunteers and even financial resources, the numbers are quite big. We know things like knowledge is important. In Seattle, when the police were having a hard time identifying crack houses, not because they couldn't identify crack houses, there just wasn't enough people in uniform to do that kind of work because there's been many things going on. A resident group got together, and within a year they had identified spontaneously 47 different crack houses. They were like their intelligence unit in that neighborhood. There's lots of underutilized assets that could be tapped into if one goes into and works the neighborhoods in the right way. And my favorite really underutilized asset, or the one that I think is most powerful, is social capital. This idea of social capital, about community, the more connections we have and trustful reciprocal relationships, i.e. the more community we have, which manifests itself strongly at the neighborhood level, the more healthy we're going to be. And the evidence is as good as it's going to get about the more vibrant, active socially connected people in the neighborhood, the healthier the neighborhood. Robert Putnam gives the example, or Jane Jacobs does, of two neighborhoods in Chicago in the early 1990s, North Lawndale and South Lawndale. And do you remember that heat wave, about 93, 94? People were dying, and then it followed a year or two later.
This is Chicago's News. 2 News at 10.
An incredible day of extreme heat is sending everybody searching for relief. We woke up to a warm 81 degrees, but that was 6 this morning. By noon, it was up to 97 degrees. We broke a record for the day at 3:55 this afternoon when the mercury rose all the way to 104. And that's just 1 degree shy of tying the all-time high in Chicago. And tonight, it's still a scorcher out there.
Well, North Lawndale and South Lawndale, one had 100, it was like 10 per X number of thousand seniors who had died. The next was 100. They had 10 times the death rate for seniors in contiguous communities. And so the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta came down and they spent $18.1 million. And they found out, then hold on to this, because you could use this during the next heat wave, that people who died were not drinking enough water and they were in hot apartments. Yeah, it's good research, huh? For $18 million.